Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 25th of June 2013. My name is TotalBiscuit with today's gaming news and comment. Coming up in the show, former Painkiller and Bulletstorm creative director on the subject of used games and why he believes that the changes are not in fact good for the consumer. Yes, this debate will not die. And various indie studios chime in on the subject of Xbox One versus PlayStation 4 indie development. All this and the OC Remix track of the day is coming your way right about now. The inevitable backlash against the backlash has, of course, now begun, with industry figures speaking out on the subject of used games and why, in fact, the change by Microsoft in regards to its used game policy is not, in fact, good for anybody. Now, I say anybody because initially we had people focusing on the development side of things, claiming, yeah, this is bad for developers and publishers, but recently we have had some people in the industry speaking out in favor of consumers, believing that in the short term this is fine, but in the long term this is actually harmful to the very people it's supposed to be helping. Now, of course, we've had various outspoken individuals such as Cliffy B on the subject. However, we have something of a less aggressive approach, let's just say, from the former People Can Fly creative director. This was the guy behind Bulletstorm, as well as, of course, the classic Painkiller. Goes by the name of Adrian Chimilaz, I think, or something along those lines. I'm damned if I can pronounce that name. Whatever the case, he's also the co-founder of the Astronauts, who have revealed their first game, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter. So we'll see what comes of that. Regardless, his opinion is quite interesting and quite nuanced, and I think it's probably one of the best descriptions from inside the industry yet that actually gets to the core of the matter. It's more often than not the case that issues in the gaming industry, or just issues in life in general, are perceived in a very black and white manner. Either it's good or it's bad, it's black or it's white. Shades of grey seem to be outside of the perception of some people. Whatever the case, let's go into his argument. So, he introduces the concept of keep the disc in the tray. And this was in response to the fact that a lot of people trade in video games. So, what does the industry do in response? They try to build things that will keep the disc in the tray, which means that it's not going back to the shop, okay? So, that's the initial mantra. Now, how did they do it, more to the point? Well, DLC was one of the big ways to do that, and he claims that that's because they can say to you, don't sell your copy yet, there is more to come. Now, while it didn't work for all gamers, it did work for enough of them to actually pay $5, $10 to $15 for additional content that, according to him, only took a tiny fraction of developer resources and took way less time than it ever would to make a full game, and yet, the actual content cost up to 25% of the actual game's retail price. So you're talking about $15 DLC on a $60 title. Now, he also talked about artificial extenders, the notion that games' lengths are deliberately padded to keep the disc in the drive, but also, interestingly enough, to keep the disc on the shelf. He says that while the minority of people actually finish the longer games, it doesn't really matter that much because it goes back on the shelf and they promise that they'll beat it later. They never do, but they hold on to it with the idea that they might. The last thing he describes as a way to try to make a little bit extra money and compensate for the used game market is the idea of microtransactions. He believes that if you've dropped $60 on a title, you're not going to be averse to investing a couple more dollars into it because you're already invested. So it's a fairly similar idea to free-to-play games, only applying it to a full-price title, which is most assuredly not a good thing at all. Now, he goes on to say that devs don't want to do all of this stuff, but they're kind of forced into the position where they have to. Now, it's either by publishers or it's simply due to the reality of the industry that they need to keep the doors open and they're not able to do so. And he repeatedly points to used games as being one of the biggest reasons. His final point is that nobody really knows how to best tackle it, but Microsoft were taking a fairly extreme step to do it. He describes it as hastening the death of the wounded animal, a mercy killing, when it comes to boxed games, which is a format that we will eventually move away from, and I don't think there's any way around that. That's the reality of the situation. More and more people buy digital. Eventually, this stuff will go digital. Eventually, trading in will not happen. He concludes his point by saying that we are now condemned to watch that animal slowly die and flail about anyway, and that if games were an awful lot cheaper, then honestly people wouldn't care about their right of first sale. If you want to read the full article, it's in the description below this video. It's a lot of really interesting points, some of which I hadn't considered, some of which kind of line up with my own views on the issue, which are, as you are well aware, not particularly popular, but they're hardly alone. They are certainly shared by people within the industry. Let's tackle DLC first. I think that the fact that DLC doesn't cost anywhere near as much to make as the full game is not actually that relevant to gamers. I think what's relevant to gamers is what they perceive as value. Now, if you can produce a piece of content that is lengthy enough and enjoyable enough for the player, for the cost that they're paying for it, they don't care how long it took you to make it. They don't care how much it costs to make it. That's irrelevant to them. That's not information that they need to know. It's also why they don't care that the full game cost $1 bazillion to make. They want to buy the game for $60. They don't want to buy it for $70, $80, or whatever you want to push it up to. That's also the flip side of it. So what you need to provide is a good value proposition. You need to put this content forward and say, right, it's X number of hours, it's this content, this is what we add to it, and make it attractive to the consumer. We're not really concerned as to how much it costs to make Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. Most of that is just a lot of reskins, some voice acting and things like that. That's actually fine. It doesn't matter that it uses all of the same assets. We're actually fine with that, because it was a fun game for $15. That's all that really matters. Did it provide enough fun value for that time, for that price tag? And if the answer is yes, then you're pretty cool. The problem is, of course, with DLC, more often than not, the answer is no. You look at stuff like Call of Duty map packs as a prime example of something that costs far too much for what it actually is, but you don't really have a choice. If you want to keep playing the multiplayer, you need to buy those map packs because it splits the population. It makes it much, much harder to find online games, and more to the point, it dilutes the talent pool as well. If you're looking to play at the higher levels, then you need those map packs because you will not find the skilled players that you need in the vanilla maps. As far as I'm concerned, that business model is pretty damn predatory. It forces you, essentially, to buy this DLC and buy into the whole notion that $15 for 4 maps is actually reasonable, which, as far as I'm concerned, it's not. Now, all credit to them, the later map packs, especially for Black Ops 2, have included more content, whether it be new weapons or zombie maps and things like that. But at the end of the day, that content cost far, far less to make. It cost very, very little indeed, and I would not be surprised at all if the actual marketing behind those map packs cost more than making the map pack did. Now, he also points out that devs don't want to be making this stuff. They would much rather be making new games for you, but they don't really have a choice in the matter. Once they've launched the game, they need to think about, all right, we're going to support this game for a year with DLC content instead of actually working on a new title, which means that you get less new IP, you get less new ideas, unless, of course, they're presented in a DLC form, which sometimes they are. Sometimes you do get things like Blood Dragon, which do present new ideas in a DLC form, or Red Dead Undead Nightmare, things like that. But he has a valid point. DLC can't be ripped off by the used game market. It's just not possible. So you enter a situation where DLC is a desirable form of business for all of these AAA titles. And you can keep complaining about DLC, but you've got to wonder, well, why is it there? However, I would like to say that it's very much an insider view, and I do not actually believe that these companies would stop making DLC. At least I don't believe the publishers would. I think that if the developer had complete creative control, they probably wouldn't. Maybe they make an expansion, and then they move on to the next title. They don't make 4 or 5 pieces of DLC, they don't sell microtransactions within their games, and so on and so forth. But I think the publishers would, without question, even if the used game market was not a factor. Now, what about the lower price point argument? I've been in favor of that for quite some time. Admittedly, I'm not in favor of games just flat out coming out for $15 on launch. I'm in favor of tiered pricing. The idea of the long tail, the idea of the multi-tiered price point, the notion that if you wait, you will get it cheaper, and that's pretty much a guarantee. And that's really the model that's been as successful as it has on Steam. Lots of people still buy games brand new for $60 on Steam. That is the reality of the situation. I am looking at it right now. And then others will wait. And honestly, does it come down to the fact that people, instead of paying $60, are choosing to pay $15? Or was it that these guys couldn't actually afford the $60 to begin with? I think the desire to play a game on day one is very strong, especially if it happens to have a multiplayer community. You want to get in on the ground floor. Last thing you want to do is come in behind there. But I would argue that a lot of people are, instead of just waiting for the $15 discount, because I don't think gamers are that patient, I really, really don't, they just can't afford the $60 to begin with. So in that respect, they were never a customer, right? And more to the point, if they can buy 4 games for $15 each instead of 1 game for $60, there's still profit going in there, and there's profit being spread around more so than being sunk into one studio or into one publisher. That's a good thing for the industry, as far as I'm concerned. And he's entirely right, by the way. You know, I don't care about my right of first sale because my games are cheap. I can get these games and pay ridiculously low amounts for them. I look at, say, Dead Island Riptide. That came out 2 months ago. $20. $20. Dead Island Game of the Year Edition came out, what, a year and a half ago? $5. The Mountain Blade Collection. That's 3 games for $8.74. War of the Roses Kingmaker, initially a $30 game, now $5. It's like, you could just pull the trigger on that and say, you know what, I won't get a McDonald's meal tonight, I'll just have that. And there's plenty more examples. Discount after discount after discount. Low-risk purchases. It makes consumers more adventurous. It makes them willing to actually step out of their comfort zone a little bit and try something that perhaps they didn't feel was really gonna be for them. I mean, the fact that the Crusader Kings 2-pack that was on discount was like top of Steam. Crusader Kings 2 is a grand strategy. Like, how many people do you really think are comfortable within a game like Crusader Kings 2? Probably not that many. It's very much a niche title, but it doesn't matter because you slash that price down and suddenly people are willing to take a risk. And suddenly, those games that you said, oh, this isn't commercially viable, it suddenly is. It's funny how that works, isn't it? Now, do used games shut all of that down? No, they don't. Yeah, let's get that completely out of the way right now. They don't. Used games can do exactly the same thing. You can take a risk on a title because it's cheaper. It doesn't matter why it's cheaper, whether that's because it's a used game or whether it's because it is just discounted in a sale. It doesn't matter to the consumer why, it only matters that it's cheaper and they're willing to take a bigger risk on it. The problem is, of course, that if you take a risk on a sales title and you buy it, the money still goes to the dev and the publisher. You do it on a used game, it doesn't. And that's perhaps the biggest difference there. So you're not actually directly seeing benefit to the people that made the game if you end up taking the risk on the used title, which is why Steam is just a flat-out better model for a lot of these developers. Was there even a guarantee that these sales would occur on the Xbox One if used games were stamped out? No. And this is perhaps the biggest problem here. The biggest issue with trying to go Steam on a closed platform like that. It's that Microsoft won't let anyone else sell games on the system because they have a monopoly on that. Why would they? What's the benefit to them? Why would they let, say, Amazon sell directly digitally to an Xbox One? You can do that on a PC because it's an open platform. You can't do that on an Xbox because Microsoft is like, well, no, I don't want to let you do that. I'm just going to say you can only buy digitally from my store, and that's where I get the lion's share of those profits. And hell, you know, if you can cut the retailer out of it, so much the better. Especially good for selling first-party titles. If I was going to be optimistic, I would say that Microsoft gets savvy at that point and does start offering those games at a lower price point, and they have the frequent sales and stuff like that. Now, the benefit, of course, is that if they don't, they potentially lose market share to systems that do allow that, because used games and the ability to just get games cheaper is a selling point, which is why they have to lower the price of titles or give games away for free. The cynical side of me says, of course, they don't give a damn. Their brand is strong enough, and if they cut out the sales of used games entirely, they could sell less copies of the game and still make as much, if not more, money. It's a complex issue, isn't it? I want to read more from industry guys. I really, really do. It's very, very interesting to see their point of view on this. And I don't disagree with them. I'm sorry. There are some pretty strong and clear arguments against used games. And whether or not that's an unpopular opinion really isn't relevant. We shouldn't be afraid to express unpopular opinions just because people might not like them. Indie studios have spoken to VG247 on the subject of the PlayStation 4 versus the Xbox One in terms of their support for indies. Gaijin Games, Introversion, Hello Games, and Brian Provinciano have talked a little bit about the difficulties of getting these games onto current generation systems versus the approach of the next-gen systems. Now, we already know, of course, that the Xbox One will not be allowing self-published titles. They will be forcing the indie devs to acquire a publisher first in order to get on the system. Microsoft Studios is a publisher, but of course it is very picky. So as a direct result, it means that a lot of indies are going to end up being shut out of the Xbox One. Now, the PlayStation 4's approach is to not do any of those things and to hopefully open the floodgates to a lot of indie titles. However, there are some rather interesting concerns and things that I hadn't really considered going into this that are actually stated by these indie devs. I'd recommend reading the full article. The link is in the description below this video. But to pick out a couple of interesting points, firstly, the claim is that both consoles, at least in the current generation, have required significant hoop jumping. There's a lot of red tape in the way, more often than not, and the delays and the sheer cost of getting all of the paperwork sorted out can, in fact, severely damage some indie studios because they can't wait that long. There were claims that titles such as Retro City Rampage took over a year of wrangling in order to actually get it onto the Xbox 360, even though the PC and the 360 versions were, in fact, feature identical. In comparison, he says it took 3 days worth of work in order to get it onto Steam. Admittedly, this entire article does not actually mention Greenlight in any way, shape, or form, which is quite strange. There's a lot of lauding of Steam going on here, but for the most part, it's by developers that did not have to go through the Greenlight process, and I imagine they were fairly happy about that. There are, of course, a lot of devs that do have to go through the Greenlight process and are considering it very much the same kind of thing. The concern is that 1- or 2-man indie studios, or even just small development houses, do not have the resources, they don't have the legal support, they just don't have the time to be working on a bunch of paperwork or doing a bunch of marketing for their game before they're even able to get it on Steam to begin with. Yeah? That's the concern. That's what this article doesn't actually touch on in any way, shape, or form, which is really strange. But it's the same thing as dealing with all of this nonsense and all of the barriers to getting onto the current gen console. Surely, it's just done in a different way. It's a case of appealing to the masses before even having to actually market your game. It's like you have to market the campaign, which lets you get the game on Steam so you can then market the game to sell it on Steam. It's a pre-marketing. It's nonsense, really. And it's very much the same waste of resources. And he also points out that even a month's delay can be a big deal to indie studios because, of course, they spend a lot of money. Or they've taken out a loan and they've got to start paying it back. They need to start getting some revenue pretty much immediately. Once the game's done, they need to be able to release it and actually sell the bloody thing. And more often than not on these systems, they're not really able to do that. However, there are some concerns even about the PlayStation 4 and the fact that the openness of the platform to indies may in fact reduce the visibility of the title. Indie developer Tiger Style, that was behind Waking Mars and Spider, The Secret of Bryce Manor, posted some interesting sales stats about their titles on iOS, and they noticed that there was a massive drop just a couple of weeks after it had gone on sale. And why? Why was that drop there? It's because of visibility. They got these massive spikes every time there was a sale because they gained visibility from the sale. But the problem with iOS is there are so many games, it's very difficult to actually break through. And they believe that the same problem may in fact occur on PlayStation 4 as well, because it would be a huge platform and individual visibility would end up being an awful lot lower. A lot of interesting points made there. I'd recommend that you read the entire article because it is very intriguing to see it from the point of view of indie devs. And needless to say, there's an awful lot of support for both Steam and PlayStation 4. Admittedly, as I said before, these are from developers that did not have to go through the Greenlight process, so I have a feeling that their opinions may have been a little bit different if they had. Alright folks, that wraps me up for the day. Thank you very much for watching the content patch. Before I go, I'd like to give you the OC Remix track of the day. If there's one rule of thumb that I like to abide by when it comes to video game music, it's you don't screw with the Guilty Gear soundtrack. However, every rule, of course, has to have its exceptions, and in this case, I'm going to give it to Beat Drop for his track called Alpha Blade, which is a remix of Sucker Sage. The original composer of that track was Daisuke Ishiwatari, and I mean, the entire soundtrack for Guilty Gear is absolutely fantastic. In this case, it is a straight-up trance remix. It pretty much is about as simple as it gets, but it sounds good. It's a full sound. It's energetic. It's consistently pumping, and I like it a lot. So let's see if you do too. It's called Guilty Gear X Alpha Blade. Its download is available in the description below this video. Thank you very much for watching, folks. I'll see you next time.